At least, I will give an introduction to our speaker. Quick question though, how many of you are related to Eric? I love it. They all sat on one side. What does that say about y'all? That's great. Well, we're so glad you all are here, whether you're related or not. Eric Linner is the fourth generation of Linners working in the construction industry and from Stillwater. His great-grandfather, Frank W. Linner, grandfather Lawrence W. Linner, and father, David B. Linner, were all carpenters and contractors. Eric is a retired architect focused on institutional buildings, including schools and government buildings. His love for genealogy started 50 years ago when his grandmother piqued his interest in family history, which inspired him to research his great-grandfather's construction history. So we're very, very fortunate to have him. Give him a warm welcome.
Thanks, Emily. And like Emily said, I'm Eric Linner, and thanks for coming tonight to view my presentation on my great-grandfather, Frank W. Linner, and his business, Frank W. Linner and Company. Technology to work here, there we go. When I first talked to Emily about this, I think it was about a year ago, on my desire to present this program, she asked me, well, how did you get interested in this? And as she just said, I got interested about 50 years ago when my grandmother, Mavis Seymour Linner, got me interested in the family history. She's pictured here with her parents, Louis H. Seymour and Rosella Canfield. Her father, Louis, had a brother-in-law who was a dentist in Hartford, Connecticut, and for a hobby, he was a serious genealogist. He researched the Seymour family history in the late 1800s, and the letter to the left is from him in 1896 to his brother-in-law, Louis. And then Louis worked at Minnesota Mercantile, as you can see from the header on the paper on the right, and I'm sure he either typed it up or had somebody at work type it up for him. Both the Seymour and Canfields immigrated to the United States in 1639. So there's a lot of history to research on that side of the family. When I was growing up, I often heard, if your great-grandfather wouldn't have changed his name, you would have been a Carlson. I have since learned that that is not correct. As in Sweden, back in the day, your last name came from your father's first name. So Frank Linner's father was Gustav Carlson, so Frank would have been a Gustafson, like his brother Carl Gustafson, who stayed on the family farm in Sweden. Frank had three cousins on his mother's side, Isaiah, Carolina, and Matilda, who arrived in Stillwater starting in 1870. They had changed their last name to Linder. Whoops. It's very probable that they encouraged him to immigrate to Stillwater. Four of his five brothers, John, David, Joel, and Alex, followed him to Stillwater and also worked as carpenters. John stayed a short while in Stillwater and then ended up moving to Minneapolis. David stayed for about 40 years in Stillwater, and then when he retired, he built a house in Prospect Park. Joel lived in Stillwater until he passed away in 1897 of appendicitis. And Alex moved to Denver sometime in the 1880s, and he died from the flu pandemic in 1892 in Denver, and actually is buried in a mass grave out there. Frank's wife-to-be, Augusta, actually arrived in Minnesota before Frank in the May of 1879. Augusta had four siblings who also followed her to Minnesota. And we are very fortunate to have trunks from both Frank and Augusta in our family still, from when they first came over. Frank and Augusta were married the same year they came to America at the home of Frank's cousin, Isaiah Linder, with Pastor Tornell of the Swedish Lutheran Church, now Trinity, administering the ceremony on November 29th, 1897. This photo of the Linner family was taken around 1900. In 1889, Frank and his brother David bought lots in the 300 block of West Hickory for $49 and $50. David built a house at 314 West Hickory, and I just learned tonight that my cousin Scott actually lives in that house. And he did not know that, nor did I. Frank and family did not build next to brother David, but stayed in the house they had previously purchased it in 1886 at 709 West Hickory, so just a few blocks up Hickory Street. Frank and Augusta had 6 children. Anna, the oldest, was a school teacher who taught at the Lincoln School on 3rd Street and also in Brainerd, and she married an artist named David Herman Johnson in New York City in 1905, and they lived there for a few years. They also lived in Virginia, Minnesota, and eventually settled in Oak Park, Illinois. They had 3 children, Lenore, Charlotte, and Herman. And Herman changed his name to Bud because during World War I, the kids in school called him Herman the German. And so he immediately changed his name to Bud. They moved to El Monte, California after retirement, and Anna passed away there at the age of 75. Jenny, also a school teacher, worked in Two Harbors, Hibbing, Denver, Colorado, probably to visit her uncle's family, and Grand Forks, North Dakota. Jenny passed away at the young age of 30. Frances, a reviser at West Publishing in St. Paul, married George Fossen, a civil engineer, and passed away shortly thereafter, also at the young age of 32. Alice was a department store clerk at M.L. Murphy's in Stillwater and Field Schlick and Company in St. Paul. She lived in Duluth before marrying Joseph Phelan, a salesman, and had sons Stephen and Frank. She died in Stillwater at the age of 54. Ed started out as a draftsman for Hanley Casey Company, the contractor for the new prison in Bayport. Was an electrician employed in St. Paul before World War I, and then owned the Linner Electric in Stillwater. He married Charlotte Rolfer and had 2 girls, Joyce and Jean, and 2 boys, Edwin and Alan, and Ed is here tonight. Ed passed away at the age of 76 in Stillwater. And last but not least is Lawrence, my grandfather, who managed a lumberyard in New Richmond, and then owned Dependable Fuels, selling coal in Stillwater, and took over his father's construction business. He married Mavis Seymour and had 1 girl, Marcia, and one of her daughters is here today, Lori, and had 3 boys, Howard, Billy, and my father, David. Lawrence died at the age of 70 in Stillwater. Let's look at Frank's employment history before he started his own business. When I first came across this, that Frank worked at the prison, it really baffled me. In doing more research, I discovered that Northwestern Manufacturing and Car Company operated a plant within the prison. Seymour Sabin Company, who managed Northwest Manufacturing, was awarded a contract to operate the factory leased from the state for $1,500 per year and employed 375 citizens with full operating capacity of 1,000, as well as over 300 prisoners worked at the plant. What really interests me was the production of the plant per day. They built 15 freight cars per day, 10 farm wagons, 6 threshing machines, $1,000 worth of sash and doors and blinds, and also horsepowers 5, which I don't know what that is, and farm engines too. And I did have actually have a time slip that I found in my great-grandfather's stuff from when he worked there. Frank worked for Thomas Roney building houses in the mid-'80s. The house on the right is one he most likely worked on. And for a couple of years, he worked as a wagon repairer, a trade that he learned in Sweden. Around 1800, he worked for Sven Berglund building houses. The picture on the left is a house he probably worked on. Frank, his future partners Charles Larson and John Granquist, as well as his former boss Sven Berglund, all worked together at Stillwater Manufacturing. The 1890s saw 4 recessions, and construction probably fell off, requiring them to work in the factory. Most houses built back in the day had built-ins like china cabinets, fireplace surrounds, and stairwells, all prefabbed at a plant like Stillwater Manufacturing. And the carpenters on the house build just assembled them. They also made the windows and the doors and the moldings that were used in those houses. Frank Linner Company is founded in March of 1897 with partners John Granquist and Charles Larson. According to the newspaper article, the firm guarantees first-class work in every particular. And I just love this early invoice from Atwood Lumber Company. It lists for work out of town with a fare and return for $5.90 and a hotel bill of 75 cents. Franklin Linner Company's shop was at 312 South 2nd Street, just north of Bluff City Lumberyard. And that's before it burned in 1965 and moved to where the Grand is now, and south of the current telephone building. That tower you see in the back is Northern States Power Company gasification tower that supplied gas through wooden pipes in Stillwater businesses and homes. The first building permit was for work on James Bronson's home at 714 South 3rd to add porches and build a woodshed with a value of $1,000, which would be approximately $37,900 today. And so this is a really good example of the building permits. So the Stillwater Library has building permits from Stillwater from 1880s up until the 1940s. And I use all of those to do most of my research. They are available online as well now too. Frank's company did a lot of work for the county and the city. They probably got more revenue from the county than any other client. When I was researching newspaper articles, month after month, they would be getting paid from the county for doing small jobs here and there. Note the cost of $5 for the work at the city jail in 1897. I imagine that was a full day's worth of work for one carpenter. This was the first Stillwater building permit for a new building the company pulled in 1897 for Alex Johnson, who was the president of Stillwater Hardware, located at 211 South Main. The barn located on 4th Street had a footprint of 576 square feet. The barn has since been torn down, although I'd assume is in the same spot as this replacement building. So I couldn't find no pictures of the original barn. This house was built for Frank Olson in 1898, who was an expressman and teamster. It is just south of Mulberry on the west side of Owens. It had a footprint of 1,472 square feet and cost $1,500. Also in 1898, a house was constructed for Charles Staples, who owned Heisel and Staples Lumber, located at 2 Mauer Block in downtown Stillwater. He was one of 3 sons of Isaac Staples. Isaac was well known in Stillwater with his mansion on the site of Pioneer Park, and he was also involved in the following enterprises: Oakland Farm, a grocery at 101 North Main, a meat market at 106 South Main, logs and pine boards at 307 East Myrtle, Stillwater Gas and Electric Light Company, 101 South Main, Staples Atlee Sawmill Company located at 1412 to 1414 North Main, and McCusick Farm in Lakeland. The house has a footprint of 1,064 square feet, was designed by architect W.J. Keith, and cost $2,000. Located just north of St. Michael's Church, across the street from the courthouse. Charles was mayor of Stillwater at the time this house was built. With the tower you see on the right, I would definitely call this a Queen Anne style. Frank also did work for Charlie's widow, Addie, on a house at 424 North 4th in 1923. I used the footprint of the houses because I'm not sure exactly, how much was in the second floor, and then how much was usable space in the attic. So the houses were much bigger than, when I say footprint, they're probably at least twice that, probably 1.5 times as large. Frank was elected to the city council in 1903 and served one term, getting beat in his reelection for a second term. As you can see, there were close races back then, with Frank winning by 7 votes. I read in the newspaper that one of Frank's initiatives while on the council was to stop dumping horse manure on the bank of the St. Croix in downtown Stillwater. I guess you could say he was an early environmentalist. When I first saw this, I thought, wow, Stillwater had auto races back in 1904. And then my son Tyler said, probably horse and buggy races, Dad. So the Frank Linner Company built an amphitheater at the Lily Lake racetrack. They had an architect, Eugene Smith, and it was built for Charles Mosier, the president of the Lily Lake racetrack, for $2,500. The picture in the lower right is of my great-grandfather, Lewis Seymour, with his horse and buggy in downtown Stillwater, although I doubt he raced at the track. I often wondered if he used that to commute from the Minnesota Mercantile on Water and Myrtle up to his house on South 3rd or not. In 1902, the county fairground in South Stillwater, now of course Bayport, was destroyed by fire, and the fair relocated to the Lily Lake racetrack until it could be rebuilt. In 1905, Frank Linner Company built this house for James Bronson, Secretary of Eastside Lumber, located at 109 South Main, with their lumber yard on the east side of the St. Croix in Holton. I assume that's why they called it Eastside Lumber, but I'm not sure. Located at 1309 South 3rd, the home had a footprint of 1,443 square feet, designed by architect Lewis Lockwood, and cost $5,000. This was the largest house the firm built. I would call this a Queen Anne style with Gothic revival elements. If you recall, James Bronson was the first permit Frank Linner pulled in 1897 to add porches to his house on 3rd Street. For those of you who grew up in Stillwater and knew George Bancroft from Stillwater Hardware, his mother, Estelle, was James Bronson's daughter. Estelle would have been 11 when they moved into this house. In 1905, this simplified Queen Anne house on Harriet between Pine and Oak was built for Myrna Wadier, whose husband, a Stillwater physician, had passed away 14 years prior. It has a footprint of 960 square feet and cost $2,000. Myrna Canfield Wadier was the sister of my great-grandmother, Rosella Canfield Seymour. Myrna and her daughter Pearl ended up moving to Bat Cave, North Carolina. I always thought that was a cool name for a city, and when my sister Chris and I were working on our national park bucket list, heading to Congaree National Park in South Carolina, we just had to stop to see the house they lived in on a beautiful stream in Bat Cave. In 1906, M.L. Murphy hired Frank to construct a new house for his family. He was president and manager of M.L. Murphy Company, a department store located on the west side of Main Street, just north of the former St. Croix Drug, or Ziggy's Pizza today. Frank's daughter, Alice, also worked as a clerk at Murphy's. The American Foursquare Queen Anne style house at 520 Pine Street has a footprint of 1,380 square feet and costs $7,000. And I assume this house is more like 3,500 square feet with the attic space. Shortly after her husband Alex Johnson's death in 1906, Mrs. Ida Johnson commissioned this house to be built. Alex Johnson was vice president of the Nelson Johnson Company, selling logs and lumber. I think he also owned Stillwater Hardware. The house has a footprint of 1,200 square feet and cost $3,000. I believe this is the same Alex Johnson that Frank built the barn for across the street. It sits near the top of Chestnut Street stairs. I believe it was later owned by Judge Howard Albertson, and my father remodeled the kitchen in the early 70s in this house. This is my favorite house, as you can see by my intro slide. In 1908, the Swedish Lutheran Church, now Trinity, hired the company to construct a parsonage at the northwest corner of 4th and Mulberry. With a footprint of 1,408 square feet, this Queen Anne-style house was designed by architect C.L. Blomberg and costing $5,000. Frank was a deacon at Trinity Lutheran and on the building committee for the parsonage. So was it a real surprise that he got the contract? I was lucky enough to tour this home a couple weeks ago. And the owners are telling me that when they purchased the home about 10 years ago, during the pre-purchase inspection, the inspector took a string and pulled it diagonally across the house on the first floor and discovered the floor was within a quarter-inch of level. And that is amazing for a 100-year-old house. And when I toured the house, I discovered that they had two poured concrete bearing walls down in the basement that I'm sure helped make sure that house didn't sag at all. And I could imagine that they probably built that, mixed that concrete on site as well. And when I was touring, I took a couple pictures on the inside. You know, the built-ins like the china cabinet, the fireplace surround, and the stairwell probably came from Stillwater Manufacturing, all prefabbed and just installed on site by Frank's carpenters. It was also interesting that a pastor's parsonage had servants because they had servants' quarters up on the upper level with a stairway that came off the kitchen to get up to them. I don't know, Chris, do pastors make that much anymore? In 1907, a fire at the Stillwater City Hospital burned out 2 rooms in the roof above. The hospital is located at the corner of Southeast Churchill and Greeley near the current hospital. It was noted that Frank's initial repair estimate was $535.95, and the final cost was $443.80. Pretty unusual for a government project to come in under budget. Antoinette Staples' husband, David Bronson Staples, was the youngest son of Isaac Staples, contracted for a new house in 1908 for their Oak Glen farm. The beautiful stone simplified craftsman-style house has a footprint of 1,520 square feet and cost $3,000. This was one of the hardest houses to find. I knew that the Oak Glen farm kind of went from McCusick Lake up around there, and I looked in back of Stonebridge Elementary and all around that area for the house. And the only clue I said it was on White Bear Road north of Owens. And I just couldn't get in my head where this was. And then I discovered that Isaac Staples' farm also went up into where the Stillwater Country Club was. And I go, well, I'm going to look up closer north where the country club was. So this is Owen Street, and this is Sycamore. And then this was the White Bear Road. And then and this is the house. And then in 1972, the county put in Stonebridge Trail this way. And so White Bear Road became Sycamore. So now the house is on Sycamore. It's not on White Bear Road anymore. So some of the things I had to do was a lot of detective work to find things here. And then I wondered how much stuff did Frank's company do outside of Stillwater, because I had access to building permits in Stillwater, but I really didn't have access to anything else. I think that's very unusual for a city to keep building permits that long. And so then I relied on the newspaper, and I found this article that had a lot of press on the contract for the Corps of Engineers dredge and barge facility in South Stillwater, now of course Bayport, in 1908. Linner Company built a shop of 2,304 square feet, an engine house of 2,516 square feet, and a foundation for a warehouse of 1,536 square feet. The warehouse was going to be constructed by the Corps of Engineers themselves. In one of the newspaper articles, it noted that there were 30 cars, which I assume were train cars, of lumber and timber from Washington State piled on site for the project. It's a lot of lumber. It was located south of current Anderson Windows, which is now a parking lot for them. I also found this article that in the fall of 1907, a fire caused by a lightning strike burned out the interior of the First Presbyterian Church in Hastings. Linner Company was a successful bidder in 1908 for the reconstruction of the interior of the church, which they did in 3 months. It's a big church for 3-month build. Dr. Fred Lennox was a dentist and lived in a house on Cherry Street directly south of this building. The 1,440 square foot barn was constructed in 1910 for $1,000. The barn was later converted to a house. I would consider this a Dutch revival style with a gambrel roof and steep Gothic revival dormers. In 1910, Frank was building a summer cottage on Squirrel Lake for Aurora Hospice, who was the daughter of Isaac Staples. This is the third home that Frank built for those 3 Staples, Isaac's children. It appears that these short articles in the paper were social media of the day. The article states that the cottage was completed in July and that Mr. Hospice would join them today, and they would all remain there at the lake until September. So it wasn't a weekend journey to a cabin. You went up there for the whole summer with, I suppose, when the kids were out of school. In 1910, J.P. Berkeley, who was vice president and secretary at Joseph Wolfe Company, hired the firm to build this home. The house, located at 618 South 3rd, had a footprint of 780 square feet and cost $5,000. I was really shocked when I saw this article in the paper that the house would be built in 3 months. 3 months. You have to remember that when this house was built, there weren't power tools either. Everything was done by hand. Frank also put an addition on this house in 1922 for the sum of $1,200. I would call it American Foursquare with its hip roof symmetry and front entry. I got a kick out of this article. In November 1911, Frank was hired to remove a storefront window in the Schuttinger's Bazaar department store. According to the newspaper article, the largest window of its kind in the city, to move a 2,100-pound automobile in for a giveaway. Evidently, the building had settled and the glass was in tight. The owner stated in the article, Frank Linner had the nerve. The store was located mid-block south of Chestnut, I believe, where Janda's department store was in later years. The contest for the auto, later listed as an auto piano giveaway, ended on July 4th, 1912. The auto was taken out July 16th, 1912, and Schuttinger listed it for sale at the 2nd Street garage. Maybe whoever won the contest took the piano instead. S. Blair McBeath was a lawyer that practiced out of the Lumbermen's Exchange building and had this house built in 1911. The house at 203 East Willard has a footprint of 960 square feet and cost $4,000. It's an American Foursquare or prairie box with its hip roof symmetry and front entry. This craftsman-style house was built for William Thorpe, who was secretary and treasurer of both New Store Company, which was located in Bayport at 103 Minnesota, and sold general merchandise, as well as Interstate Lumber Company. It took me some time to find out the history of Interstate Lumber Company, as they were not listed in any city directories that I could find. As a kid, I often helped my Uncle Homer, who was a contractor in Matamidi, and we would visit Interstate yards in Matamidi and White Bear and occasionally in Hugo, but I never remembered an Interstate Lumber Yard in Stillwater. I finally located a newspaper article at the library. Which stated Interstate Lumber Company had corporate headquarters at 13 Lumbermen's Exchange building and was founded by Fred Tozier in 1899. The house at 411 West Pine has a footprint of 1,008 square feet and costs $3,000. The one-room schoolhouse built at the Washington County Poor Farm in 1912 had a footprint of 912 square feet and cost $2,000. It was one of the rare buildings that Frank's company built that no longer stands. It is located at the southwest corner of 120th and Norrell Avenue, now County Road 55, which was eventually extended south past the school. The county farm became a county nursing home and is now the Pine Point Regional Park. So this is on the northeast corner of the park, this plot. In 1912, the city of South Stillwater, later to become Bayport, hired the company to build a new jail and remodel the city hall for $5,500. I worked on a couple of jails early in my architectural career. $5,500 sounds like a real deal. This large craftsman or bungalow-style home for Harrison McCusick, who was an agent for Musser Santig, a land, logging, and manufacturing company at 25 Lumberman's Exchange Building. The house, built in 1913, has a footprint of 1,800 square feet and costs $5,000. This house is at the southwest corner of Wilkin and Owens, across the street from my grandparents, so I remember seeing it a lot when I was younger. Alice Kleinoff, wife of Dr. Demeter Kleinoff, a physician and surgeon practicing at 308 Main, had this house constructed in 1913. The Queen Anne-style house at 712 South 2nd has a footprint of 930 square feet and cost $5,000. Most of the pictures I took of the houses are in the winter because I don't have the leaves and you do not see through, but this one was being remodeled in the winter and half of it wasn't painted, and so I said, I better go back and take another picture of this one. In 1914, Robert McGarry, who owned R.W. McGarry Insurance Agency at 4 Mauer Block, had this house located at 712 South 3rd. It had a footprint of 960 square feet and was built for $4,000. If you thought that the 3-month Berkeley house timeline wasn't real, here's another article discussing the same thing, a 3-month build. William Hanson was a salesman at Brodeen and Matson, a clothing and men's furnishing store at 223 South Main, who hired the firm in 1914 to build a house for his family. Located at 516 South Broadway, the house cost $4,000 and has a footprint of 780 square feet. I notice is very similar to the last house of R.W. McGarry, is an American 4-square prairie box with its hip roof symmetry and front entry. So if we just flip back, it's very similar to that one. Also in 1914, Mrs. Nellie Malloy, the widow of Robert A. Malloy, who passed away 17 years before she commissioned Frank Linner Company to build this house. Her husband was a clerk and bookkeeper for Malloy Brothers, which dealt in logs and lumber at 2 Hershey Block, 101 South Main, which I believe was in the old Cosmopolitan Bank building on the southeast corner of Myrtle and Main. The house at 111 South 4th was constructed for $6,000 and had a footprint of 960 square feet. It is a great example of prairie styling with large overhanging eaves. This was the first of 2 houses Frank built for A.W. Magnuson, who was the county register of deeds. This house, built in 1914 on North 4th, is between Laurel and Maple. It would be directly west of the Lincoln School site. This is the 4th house built by Frank Linner Company in 1914. It cost $6,000 and had a 1,200 square foot footprint. This was the only house I couldn't find a building permit for, although my father insisted that his grandfather built this house. I did find a newspaper article stating Frank Linner's crew was tearing down a homestead on this property 2 years earlier for Reuben Thurine. Reuben was a partner in the law firm of Wilson and Thurine and he was also the Washington County attorney. Frank did many jobs for Reuben Thurene during his career, and Reuben was also his attorney. So I believe that he probably did build this house. Why the county attorney got by without having to pull a permit, we'll never know. It is a great example of the Tudor style. Nocum Lot hired Frank Linner Company to build them an automobile dealership and garage. The lot sold Studebakers and Pontiacs. It is at the northwest corner of 2nd and Olive, now a parking lot. The 7,800 square foot building cost $6,500. In January 16th, 1915, the partnership between Frank Linner, Charles Larson, and John Cranquist is dissolved for the sum of $1. I'm guessing here, but I'm thinking that after a 23-month recession, his partners didn't want to share in the losses anymore. After the split, they continued on as employees of the company, so it was a friendly split, obviously. And note that Reuben Thurene signed the document as a witness. Since the Stillwater directories list Frank's former partners as carpenters working for Frank Linner Company, I'm wondering if Frank kind of ran the office side of the business and his two partners were maybe foremen on site running the construction side of it. R.B. McFeeters was a manager at the New State Prison now in Bayport and contracted to have this craftsman or bungalow-style house built in 1916. His home at 514 West Oak cost $3,000 and had a footprint of 1,232 square feet. In 1918, strategy strikes the business with the death of Nels Sandahl, who fell 12 feet off a scaffolding and died of a head injury when hitting the frozen ground working on a construction project at the Twin City Forge and Foundry plant. His partner on the scaffold also fell but landed on his feet and survived. The Twin City Foundry made some big stuff. Frank built a craftsman-style house in 1919 for Archibald Smith, who worked as a steward at the Stillwater Club located at 229 East Myrtle, which is where No Neck Tony's Bar is. The house had a footprint of 816 square feet and cost $4,480. It was designed by architect J.D. McNulty. Most of my career as an architect, I worked on K-12 schools. And in 1919, the firm remodeled a chemistry and a physics lab and 4 classrooms for $1,216, which in my mind is just unbelievable. This is the old high school that burned to the ground over Christmas break in 1957 with the fire starting in the chimney. My dad was a new volunteer fireman at the time, and my mom took me to the fire as a 10-month-old. This was a big fire for Stillwater, with the help coming from fire departments all around, including St. Paul. They dumped so much water on the fire that the tunnel that ran under the street to the junior high completely filled up with water. And Stillwater lost a 30-year-old American LaFrance fire truck that blew an engine at the fire too. William Wilhelmson was an estimator at Stillwater Manufacturing located on North Main Street. He had this house constructed in 1921. The 26 by 28 foot bungalow style house at 310 West Maple had a footprint of 720 square feet and cost $6,000. I would imagine that great-grandpa Frank ran into him numerous times in ordering materials from Stillwater Manufacturing. Also in 1921, Frank Wolf, owner of Wolf Electric Company, located at 321 East Chestnut, which would be just east of Leo's Grill today, had this house built. His simplified craftsman-style house has a footprint of 728 square feet and cost $7,000. It was located at 818 West Pine. It's really obvious that the construction costs are going up after World War I, with the houses getting smaller and the costs are increasing. I wanted to throw this project in as a comparison to cost today. Can you believe a new roof for $200? This was in 1921. Again, the social media post in the paper that stated, contractor Linner had just completed the work of putting on a fine cedar shingle roof on the home of Mrs. J.F. Matheson, South First Street. The city of Stillwater hired Frank to construct a bathhouse at Lily Lake Beach on the southeast shore of the lake in 1922. The 1,976 square foot structure cost $2,900. I'm not sure if I swam at Lily Lake. I'm not sure if I ever spent any time in this bathhouse, but I probably did. I believe it was probably torn down to build the ice arena, but there are no pictures of the building itself. The Bluff City Lumber Company, located next to Frank's shop on 2nd Street, had a 2,100 square foot coal shed built next to the tracks south of Northern States Power Plant, which is now the Brick Alley, for $2,100. All of the coal was delivered by train. Another of Frank's commercial buildings not to survive. In 1918, Frank purchased the Sabin property across 3rd Street from the Lincoln School between Laurel and School Streets to tear down the house and barn to develop the site into 6 housing parcels. As I discussed earlier in the presentation, Frank's first job was with Seymour Sabin Company. This was probably great-grandpa's first housing development. When I was visiting Washington, D.C., I went to see Senator Klobuchar, and she had every picture of every senator up in her office. And I'm walking around and going, oh, there's Senator Sabin. So the same guy that great-grandpa worked for was a senator from this area as well. The Lincoln School across 3rd Street, which you can see, so this is the Sabin property, and here's the Lincoln School, and the Magnuson House was right over here that we talked about earlier. The Lincoln School across 3rd Street was torn down in the late 30s, and the stone was used to construct St. Jude's Catholic Church in Matamidi. This is the second house for A.W. Magnuson, Register of Deeds for Washington County, about the same footprint as the first one at 1,134 square feet, although costing over 60% more at $10,000. It was built in 1927. In 1928, E.O. Conrad, manager of Consolidated Lumber, located on the east side of North Main across the current Staples Mills Antiques, hired Frank to build the second house in the southeast corner of this new development. It is a large house with a footprint of 2,090 square feet and cost $8,630. This is a great example of a shingle-style house. Also in 1928, Joseph Simonet, secretary of Simonet Furniture and Carpet, located on 301 to 311 South Main, now the Midtown Antique Building, was the third house to be constructed in Frank's new development. It was a 1,584 square foot footprint and cost $8,800. It was built on 2 of the lots in the southwest corner of the development. I would call this a simplified Tudor style. John Mogren, owner of Mogren Oil, had a new filling station constructed in 1929, probably one of the first outside of downtown Stillwater, on West Welkin near Owens. That would have been the entry to the city from White Bear Lake. It cost $1,200. My grandfather's house had a footprint of 1,113 square feet and cost $7,000 in 1929. The last house in the development on the North 3rd, and is a great example of a colonial revival. My father grew up in this house. When Grandpa's older sister Alice was on her deathbed at the U of M hospital in 1935, she got her brother, or my grandfather, to agree to take in her 2 teenage boys, Stephen and Frank Phelan. He remodeled the upstairs attic for the boys to stay in. This was during the Depression, and Grandpa got 2 bids for the lumber that were almost identical in value. One bid, however, included a ride on the lumber manager's boat on the St. Croix, which sealed the deal. After moving back from Richmond, Wisconsin, Grandpa purchased Thompson's Dependable Fuels, and a few years later had his father build him a new office and truck scale with coal storage sheds out back along the railroad tracks. The 300 square foot building cost $600 in 1930, or $2 a square foot, while his house cost $3.15 a square foot. Today, most commercial buildings are more expensive per square foot than houses. This building is located where the Valley Booksellers is located. In 1931, the 1,736 square foot barn costing $3,000 was built for Henry Amundsen of Oak Glen Dairy Farm. This was located northwest of the current Stoughton Bridge Elementary. Again, another commercial building of Frank's that was razed. Here's a map of Stillwater that shows where each of Frank Linner Company's projects pulling permits were located. There were 376 permits, 35 for new buildings, 35 for fire repairs, which were mostly kitchen fires, and 306 additions and remodelings. So he kind of worked all over, but you can kind of see they were kind of located together. So I think his neighbors recommended him to other neighbors. He got more contracts. Franklin Linner Company did work for over 55 businesses up and down Main Street and other parts of Stillwater. At least 5 Protestant churches, 3 lumber companies, a couple of auto dealerships, Northern States Power Company, Northern Pacific Railroad, Stillwater Country Club, cities of Stillwater and Bayport, Stillwater Schools, and his most lucrative client, Washington County. This is one of my greatest genealogy treasures, and it's a ledger from my great-grandfather's business. And you can kind of see the ledger was passed down from great-grandfather, and then with his son Lawrence, my grandfather, and then Lawrence Linner and son, my father. I was interested to kind of track carpenter wages. So in the start of the ledger in 1924, wages were $1.10 an hour. In the Depression, they dropped to 75 cents an hour. And then they started to recover in the late 30s and really climbed after World War II to over $3 an hour. There were many permits and ledger entries for fire repairs, most of them being kitchen fires, as I said before. This entry at Trinity Church was for fire repair at the steeple in 1926. In the early 70s, the steeple was being reshingled, and Dad had stopped by to check on the progress of the project. He brought home a small wooden access panel that was painted green on one side and charred on the other. The workers on site speculated that the steeple fire probably put itself out and no one knew it happened. Little did Dad know that his grandfather was the one who repaired the steeple after the fire for a cost of $193.10, which amounted to 106 hours of labor. My dad thought that access panel was so neat he incorporated it into his bar in his basement remodel. I was surprised to see the entry for taking out storm windows at the courthouse. Installing screens and storm windows was in the ledger every spring and fall. Storm windows came out the end of May and installed on about the 1st of December. I went up to the courthouse and counted there are 75 windows in the courthouse, many of them over 8 feet high. At the course, and it took 11 hours, costing $12.10 to change out the windows. It was also interesting to see that they repaired furniture and desks at the courthouse. This entry for furniture repair was for 60 hours of labor. Replacing sash cords was very common. At the library, replacing numerous sash cords cost $2.50 for material and 8 hours of labor for a cost of $8.80. Repairing and replacing locks was extremely common as well. $3 for a new entry lock on a house and 1 hour to install. I really love this entry for nails at 6 cents. They did maintenance and replaced many roofs in Stillwater. They replaced the roof on Ed Carlson's house in 1925 at 201 East Burlington with 71 hours of labor. for a total bill of $225.03. They couldn't even round it to an even $225. Repairs at Stillwater schools was a common entry, especially wood floor replacement. Nelson School, 20 hours labor for relaying floors. Repairing floors at Greeley School, 6 hours labor. Remove old and lay new floor at Garfield School, 94 hours labor. Total bill, $132. All of Frank's children and 2 of his grandchildren attended the Garfield School, which was 2 blocks south of their house on Hickory, located on Laurel between Owens and Everett. I also found it interesting that they installed and took out Christmas trees at Murphy's store. 9 hours labor to install and 2 hours labor to remove for a total of $16.20. The actual tree cost $3. They also shoveled snow off roofs and replaced icebox hinges for 75 cents. In April 1927, this is the first entry in the ledger that subcontractors appear, including work of his son's Ed Company, the electric shop, later known as Linner Electric, for wiring in the amount of $2.32. That's probably for 2 hours worth of work. Anybody here hire an electrician in their house for $2.32? This was probably Frank's last job 3 days before his passing. As I said before, he did work for the county and every year since the inception of his business. Note repairing 5 lawn chairs at the courthouse after a storm for $10. There was also repair work done at the Poor Farm, including work at the blacksmith shop, hog house, and barn. Carpenter wages are now 75 cents an hour after being $1.10 before the Depression started. This is probably the last photo of Frank seated in the middle, circa 1933. He was 78 when he passed away. His grandson, Frank Fallon, is on the left, granddaughter Joyce on the right. Frank, daughter Alice holding her niece Jean, and son Ed in the center. This is about the time his son Ed, like his father, was elected to city council, serving until 1950 when he became mayor for another 6 years. If my math is correct, that's 23 years of service. Joyce is the only living grandchild that actually knew her grandpa Frank. And some of the things that I used for research, a lot of stuff at the Stillwater Public Library, the building permits, the city directories, and the Runk photo collection. The History Center also has a lot of that stuff online as well for the newspapers. Frank was profiled in Swedish Americans of Minnesota, History of the St. Croix Valley, Volume 1. Brent helped me with some stuff at the Historical Society here, Trinity Lutheran Church Archives, and the Linner Family Swedish Bible. So I would open it up to questions if anybody has any. Sure. You know, I knew that at one time, but I can't think of who it was here. But when I counted up the permits, I think Frank pulled about 30% of the permits in town. So he was a pretty major builder in the day. And later he did compete with like I'm trying to think of George Olson's dad. George Olson Construction was his father was building back then on commercial stuff, and so I competed with him against bids as well.
Doing your research, to figure out like how many employees there were working on these projects. A lot of things going on. They're doing it pretty quickly.
So the question is, how many employees did Frank have employed with him? And I have no idea. You know, I can kind of get a clue out of the ledger how many carpenters he had in the 20s, and it was probably around 15, I think. But I would think that he would have at least 15 to 20 on a house to do it in 3 months. I mean, yeah. Do I have any of the original blueprints? I had blueprints of my grandfather's house on 3rd Street. and Brent now has those. So, yeah.
These houses went ridiculously cheap, couple $100 up to for the lots, up to a couple $1,000. Do you know what that would equate to post COVID? Like, what does the pricing look like for inflation? Were these really expensive houses, or were they a lot of them cheaper? Or?
So how do the houses compare in cost to today's houses? I was surprised that when I took the dollar amount and inflated it, it didn't seem like it was that much. But these were big houses in the day, and I would think they would compare to any large house you would see now, any McMansion as you call them, right? You know, I do not know. It sold about 10 years ago, so we could probably look it up. I know that Gail here, a friend of our family's, told us that they were looking at buying it. When was that, Gail? How long ago? 1956 for $12,000. But they just spent a ton of money because they redid the whole inside of it, and you cannot tell. I mean, they were very careful on picking out oak to match, and it's a very respectful renovation.
It also took many years in purchasing it. The person that wanted to sell it wanted it for more, and he wasn't willing. So they waited about 4 years before they actually did purchase it for less than for what they thought was reasonable.
You know, when I was a kid in the 70s, these houses were not worth anything. No one wanted them. They would go on for very cheap. And it's amazing that none of the houses that he built have been torn down. They're all still here. Yes.
What about the interior? Is there a lot involved with that? In other words, I think about these old houses and going inside.
So the question is about the interior. So the only house that I've toured two of the houses. One is my grandfather's house, and one is the parsonage one, and you saw pictures of that. And I have to believe that they were all that elegant inside. I mean, the baseboard in that house was this high. It was just incredible. I mean, the woodworking in there. Yeah. So what kind of education did Frank have? I have no idea, how much education he had in the old country. I don't think he went to, any kind of post education. Yeah. Probably just experience, yeah. Yeah.
What's the address? I'll look up.
I believe that this handwriting here is my great grandfather's. I know that, so he had pretty good penmanship for, being. And then I know this is my grandfather's handwriting here, so in the ledger. I'm gonna fly right by it. Oh. 306 4th. Any other questions?
I have a follow-up question about early on in your presentation. There was a business that I noticed that there was nose and sashes and stuff like that. I don't really have a history with the area. There's some connection with those with built, or were they competition? Like, did they have flyers or the same?
Well, Anderson Windows wouldn't sell directly to builders. They would always go through a lumber yard, most likely. So I don't know, Brent, do you know where their market was? I know their market today is mostly out east still. Yeah, Anderson, yeah.
Windows, I think that, Linner Stillwater manufacturing. Stillwater manufacturing, where, what condo unit?
Well, it's right south of the Staples antique store, right? Well, that was,
Stillwater, or whatever it is. Yeah, they were in business for well over 125 years. They sold windows, sashes, Stillwater manufacturing. Yeah. And that company, the interior, exterior, they actually made display cases for the Bishop Museum. If you go to Honolulu, go to the Bishop Museum. Those display cases will be yours. That company.
so this is the Staples Mills antique building, right? Here, that's still down there, so.
So he didn't build a Staples mansion.
No, that was way before his time. Yeah. You know, my grandmother always used to say that Frank trusted Swedes more than anything else, and if a Swede came to the door selling something, he was buying it. So I suspect that that's probably true. Yeah, I mean,
Did you say this? How big was Frank?
I don't know how big it was, but based on the size on this map right here, I mean, it's right here. It's pretty small. I don't know if you're familiar with the telephone building on the corner here, but that's pretty small compared to that.
Is he the same relative that had someone who didn't trust anyone?
Right. The linear headstone's a big black granite with linear on it at Fairview Cemetery, and he had it shipped over from Sweden because you couldn't trust anybody here. So
The valuation on the person is
right now,
Yeah.
I believe it.
Have you started to document the house that your dad built and
You know, I don't have very good documentation on that. The permits really stopped. I have some. Have some houses, and I've done a book up to when the permit stopped, which is in, I think, the early 40s. Like, I know there was a house next to me when I grew up. Dr. Kleinoff, he built that house in 1938. So, but no, I don't have much after that. My dad really didn't write down anything, and I have the same problem. My other grandfather was a contractor in Matamidi, and he built a lot of houses there, and I just have a list that my mother gave me, but no real documentation. It's really hard to find stuff. I mean, the building permit was a thing that got me going on finding houses. So the question was about exteriors and stucco. On the building permit, they will say what the material was, and there were stucco houses. They were originally stucco. Those that we see, I think they were all originally stucco. Most of them were lap siding, though.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.